In early March, I embarked on a midweek camping excursion with my camper. The wooded area just beyond my residence featured an abundance of dirt trails, spacious enough to accommodate my truck and attached camper. This locale became my frequent retreat for a couple of nights every month. My favored spot lay down a narrow trail leading to a lake. Although the lake itself was expansive, the specific location I favored was secluded and unlikely for most to visit. Upon arrival one morning, I detached the camper from my truck and prepared my backpack for a hike. There were no marked trails in this area that I was aware of, but following the lake's edge offered a pleasant walk and ensured I wouldn't lose my way. Not far from my camper, I encountered something remarkably peculiar. A weathered and aged trailer was wedged between two trees. It appeared as if it had been in this spot for years. Yet, I had passed through here previously, and it was unquestionably absent at the time. Its recent relocation raised suspicion. I lingered at a safe distance, attempting to discern any signs of recent habitation. Honestly, just a single glance at it gave me the impression that it was deliberately concealed, perhaps to hide something. Upon closer examination, there were no indications of recent occupancy, intensifying my doubts. Why would someone exert the effort to transport an aged and battered trailer into such a remote location? My intuition urged me to depart, but an inexplicable curiosity drove me to knock on the trailer's door. There was no response and no signs of movement within. After one final knock, still met with silence, I returned to my camper. The trailer remained on my mind throughout the following hours as I sat outside, tending to my campfire. When the sun set and the stars emerged, I resumed my enjoyment of the night's tranquility. Seated in a small chair and gazing upward, savoring the peace, I suddenly heard the distinct crunch of footsteps on leaves from somewhere in the woods behind me. I turned and observed a light moving steadily between the trees as an individual walked through the forest. Encountering someone in this remote setting was indeed peculiar. I kept a vigilant eye on the figure as they proceeded toward the lake, but the light abruptly extinguished. I stared into the darkness, attempting to detect any motion, yet found nothing discernible. Eventually, faint footsteps resumed, heading in my direction. These footsteps were hushed, indicative of a deliberate effort to remain unnoticed. I rose to my feet and called out, "Hey, what do you want?" The footsteps ceased, seemingly just a few yards away from me. I awaited a response or any sign of movement, but an extended silence ensued. Eventually, the footsteps began to recede, moving back into the woods. I realized that the individual was heading in the direction of the abandoned trailer. Given the stranger's bizarre behavior and the lingering mystery surrounding the trailer, I decided not to risk staying the night. I packed up and reattached my camper to the truck, then drove cautiously down the trail with my brights illuminating the way. It took some time, but I eventually reached safety. I opted to contact the police to report the strange encounter with the man and the enigmatic trailer. The following morning, I accompanied two officers to the location of the trailer. To my astonishment, it had disappeared. Even more perplexing, there were visible tracks on the ground, indicating that the trailer had been dragged all the way to the lake, where the marks faded into the water's edge. Whatever secrets the trailer held were now concealed at the bottom of the lake, inaccessible. No evidence emerged to justify retrieving the trailer, leaving everything shrouded in mystery. It's chilling to contemplate what the man might have done had he captured me near the hidden trailer, and regrettably, I am forever haunted by the enigma concealed behind that door. The previous year, I embarked on a solo journey to a forest, approximately an hour's drive from my residence, with the intention of camping for a single night. My plans were modest, as I merely sought to spend a day outdoors before returning home. Despite my lack of experience, I saw no harm in a one-day excursion. Upon reaching the camping trail, I noticed 3 vehicles parked alongside the road adjacent to it. Uninterested in mingling with others or sharing the day with fellow campers, I continued my drive in search of an alternative trail. I had to venture further down the road, where parking spaces were scarce, and then walk back to my chosen path. This trail was notably narrow, consisting entirely of dirt without any gravel or paved surface, signifying its lack of popularity. My hike commenced through relatively level terrain, surrounded by trees and shrubbery. After about 2 hours, the trail began to taper, making it increasingly challenging to discern if I remained on the path. Although I had initially anticipated such a situation, by this point I had become somewhat unconcerned, having taken it for granted. Eventually, I decided to retrace my steps, making a concerted effort to locate the more clearly defined section of the trail. However, just 5 minutes into my return journey, I encountered a sight that halted me in my tracks. In the heart of the forest sat a cabin. My immediate thought upon seeing it was one of disorientation, as I had not observed it during my initial ascent. Subsequently, I became preoccupied with an eerie sense of unease. What could explain the presence of a cabin in such a remote location? Approaching the cabin cautiously, I noted its lack of a door and peered inside. The interior was cluttered with discarded items, evoking discomfort and trepidation. The more time I spent in its vicinity, the more disconcerted I became. My instinct implored me to leave. As I turned to resume my journey back to the trail, a loud thud interrupted my movement. I cast my gaze back at the cabin and witnessed a man emerging from behind one of its walls. He appeared middle-aged and wore tattered clothing, closely resembling someone who resided there. His unsettling expression bore no emotion as he stared at me. Nervously, I uttered an apology and hastily retreated. Glancing back as I distanced myself, I observed him fixating on me from a distance. The following hour was fraught with tension as I vigilantly scanned my surroundings, ensuring I was not being pursued. As twilight approached, my anxiety mounted. Just before darkness enveloped the forest, I finally rediscovered the main trail. I contemplated the option of returning to my vehicle, but decided to spend the night, primarily to prevent the risk of losing my way again. I arranged my tent, although my initial plans for a campfire and other activities had lost their appeal by then. My sole desire was to find respite. I lay down and closed my eyes, eventually drifting into slumber. However, my sleep was frequently interrupted. Each time I awoke, it felt as though I had been startled without any apparent cause. I attributed it to my unfamiliarity with nighttime in the forest. During one of these jolts, I noticed that the tent's entrance revealed the silhouette of a man, his head protruding through the partially opened flap. In a panic, I recoiled, causing the man to hastily retreat. I emerged from the tent and caught a glimpse of his back as he fled into the woods. My heart raced as I quickly dismantled my camp, stuffing everything into my bag. I followed the trail all the way back to my car, my mind consumed with the terrifying thought of what the man might have had in mind while I slept. His haunting presence, his eyes in the dark, remains etched in my memory. Following that incident, I never returned to the forest, and I have refrained from discussing it extensively, as I am well aware that answers remain elusive. I embarked on a camping adventure with my college buddy, whom I'll refer to as Andrew, to safeguard our privacy. We had been friends for slightly less than a year and shared a mutual appreciation for nature, frequently engaging in hikes. However, neither of us had ever experienced an overnight stay in the wilderness. This escapade took place during our school's spring break, a plan we had been shaping for some time. We carefully selected a familiar trail, and had a rough idea of where we intended to set up camp. On the day of our excursion, we set off without hesitation, delighted to find that we were the sole adventurers on the trail. We deliberately chose this trail due to its lack of popularity, ensuring a tranquil and uncrowded journey. The trail led us approximately 6 miles into the forest, where we found the ideal spot to pitch our tents. We set up our camp and enjoyed a light meal just as the sun was about to set. Andrew and I gathered large stones and sticks to build a campfire, which we ignited as darkness fell. Regrettably, we had brought along a pack of beers and began drinking as we conversed and relaxed by the fire. Our conversations were engaging, and we reveled in good times. After a few hours, we felt the need to retire for the night. We extinguished the fire, retired to our tents, and attempted to sleep. I drifted into a deep slumber quite easily, lulled by the calming sounds of nature. However, throughout the night, I found myself repeatedly waking up. There were no discernible noises causing these awakenings. I simply jolted awake for no apparent reason. I attributed this to my inexperience with nocturnal forest surroundings, although it continued to unsettle me. During one of my 4th or 5th awakenings, I heard the sound of Andrew's tent being unzipped. Initially, I assumed he was merely going outside to use the bathroom or engage in some other activity. However, I soon became aware that he had only taken a few steps from his tent, after which I heard him rummaging through his backpack. A long period of silence followed, as though he was standing just outside his tent. Concerned, I sat up and unzipped my tent to investigate. As the sound of my zipper began, I heard Andrew's footsteps hastily retreating from the front of my tent. By the time I peered outside, Andrew was crouched down, swiftly concealing something in his backpack. He then turned to look at me, his expression reflecting anxiety. I inquired about his well-being, and he hesitated for a moment before nodding. Something felt awry about the situation. I emerged from my tent and asked why he had ventured outside. He responded, explaining that he was struggling to sleep and had come out for some fresh air. While he spoke, I couldn't help but notice a handgun partially protruding from his backpack. My face paled as I glanced at Andrew, trying to mask my shock, although it was clear he knew what I had seen. We maintained an uncomfortable silence, our gazes locked for a peculiar moment. He eventually turned and retreated into his tent without uttering another word. This behavior was entirely unlike Andrew, and his guilty expression left me deeply unsettled. It was odd enough that he had failed to mention bringing a firearm, but his actions only intensified the unease. I remained awake for the remainder of the night, seated outside our tents and anxiously awaiting the arrival of dawn. As soon as morning broke, I quickly packed our belongings and departed. After that day, Andrew never reached out to me, suggesting that something unusual had occurred during that fateful night. I cannot definitively say what transpired or why, but I consider myself fortunate to have left without uncovering the truth.